Whoa, we're done with the course. We built an amazing app, and you hopefully learned a lot about many awesome Angular features, Node and Express and Mongoose and Mongo features, and how to connect them all to build an entire app where you have both a beautiful client-side Angular-driven application and a powerful backend powered by Node, Express, and MongoDB. Now it's time to deploy our application, which means move it from our local development environment to a real server in the internet where we can access it. So let's see how that will work. When deploying our application, our main application, as we built it in this course, we actually have two options of deploying it. Option number one is to deploy two separated apps. And option number two is to deploy one combined app. Now, what do I mean with that? In option number one, two apps, we have an Angular app, the front end, and we have the Node REST API, which is Node, Express, and MongoDB basically, or the access to MongoDB, I should say. In the combined app case, we have one app where we have that Node REST API, which also happens to have a route which renders or returns the Angular app. Please keep in mind, we don't have that in our current project setup yet, but I will show you how to restructure the project to use this case. Right now we have the two app case. Even though we're managing it in one project, we have our backend, which runs on localhost 3000, and we have our frontend, which runs on localhost 4200. We had to start two processes to work on our app. Now, this actually is a setup you use quite a lot when building modern single-page applications, because the Angular app is just a static app, and therefore it requires just a static host. With that, I mean a host which is capable of returning HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Examples would be AWS S3 or Firebase hosting. Of course, there are others too. We just need such a static host because an Angular app executes no server-side code. It's not connected to the Node code. We send our HTTP requests, but that is done from within the browser. So we only need to work with what the browser uses, and that's HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Hence, a server capable of returning these files is all we need. We need no PHP interpreter, and we also need no server that can execute Node. Now, for the backend, for our Node REST API, which we built, this differs. There, we need a host which is capable of running that Node.js code, which is capable of executing it. Examples would be AWS EC2 or Elastic Beanstalk, Heroku, and other hosting providers, of course. So we got these two separated apps which run on totally different domains. And that already is the case during development too. Localhost 4200 for Angular and localhost 3000 for Node sound similar, but actually, due to the different ports, these are really different domains. They're not connected. And we'll have the same setup when we deploy this. Now, if we have one combined app, this differs. There, we need a host which is capable of running Node.js, because that's the smallest common denominator, so to say. And it will then also return the Angular files whilst it's doing that. Every host can do that basically, but Node.js code, that's not something every host can do. We'll need such a host for a combined app. Therefore, we need the same options as on the left for Node.js. And one other important difference to understand is, if you have two separated apps, as we have it in our course, then we absolutely need these course headers we're setting on the Node Express backend. And we're already doing that because we have that set up. If you have a combined app, you can actually omit them, because then Angular will be hosted or will be served by the same domain on which our backend runs. So requests sent to the backend will target the same server, and therefore no course headers are required. These are the options. I will walk you through both. We will deploy the app in both ways. Let's start with the two separated apps though, because that is the setup we already have. So in our project, we have the two apps, and with that I really mean the backend and the front end. And I just squeezed that backend into the Angular CLI project, not because we could manage it through the CLI, but because that made switching between files much easier and hopefully helped you understand where I'm working in. For deployment, this can be a bit confusing though, because we are not going to deploy the entire folder. Instead, we're going to build the Angular app, and this will give us a new folder actually, which we will deploy. And we will deploy the server.js file and the files in the backend folder. And for that, to make that less confusing, I will now actually split this up, at least a little bit. I will keep the backend folder, but I will move my server.js file into that backend folder, because now all the backend related things are in one place. Now that will break our package.json file here, where we started nodemon with server.js. We would now have to point at /backend/server.js. Now if I quit both processes and I rerun npm run start server, now this still kind of works, but now it's not able to access its dependencies, because now we, moved the entire file, so all the imports here are wrong. There, it's now looking for app in the wrong folder. It should look in the same folder as itself, because now the app.js file is in the same folder. So let's look for /app. With that added, if I restart this, now it's working again. And now I need to add one other thing here. I want to move, or I want to copy, not move, copy the package.json file into the backend folder, because my backend will need certain dependencies and Angular will also need dependencies. Let's now edit that file though. The package.json file in the backend folder, I don't need all the Angular related scripts. I can even remove this one, because for development, I'll still use the other package.json file. I'm just caring about the dependencies now, because if we deploy our backend folder later, these dependencies here will be used by the hosting provider which hosts our Node.js app, because pretty much all hosting providers scan that file and install these dependencies before they start your Node app, because obviously your Node app needs them. It doesn't need the Angular ones though, so we can strip these out in the backend folder. That's important. We need bcrypt, body parser, core.js, that's the Angular one, we can remove that. We need Express, we need JSON Web Token, we need Mongoose and Mongoose Unique Validator. We need Malter. We don't need these two though. These are also Angular dependencies. And we need none of the development dependencies, because these are all just required by the Angular CLI. So now this is our stripped down package.json file for the backend. I will leave all the dependencies in the front-end file, but now for deployment, this file in the backend folder will be the important one. So with that, the backend is prepared. And before we care about Angular, the front end, let's actually deploy the backend, so this REST API, because that should work standalone. That's the idea behind these two separated apps. And we could actually connect any front-end app, be that a mobile app or another web app, to that API then. Now, for deployment, we got a lot of options. You can use your favorite hosting provider. I will go with AWS, since I really like AWS, I work with it a lot. But again, the steps in general are the same. It's this preparation which is important, and it's important to simply understand that you work with, basically with that folder structure, that you need that package.json file. We can clear all the images, by the way, of course. We don't need these. And now with that, we are prepared. So let's now go back to AWS, and there, the service for deploying a Node app would be Elastic Beanstalk. This is simply a service which will automatically set up a Node.js server and makes it easy for us to push our code to it. Here we can click Create New Application. You need an AWS account for that, of course. Enter any name you want, like Node Angular, any description you want, mean app, and hit Create. This creates the application, and now you create a so-called environment there. There, you define what you want to build. I want to build a web server for a website. You can give it a name. I'll leave the default. Add a domain. I'll leave the default. Add a description if you want. And now for the platform, you can choose one of these pre-configured ones, like, of course, Node.js in our case here. And I don't want to start with a sample application, but I want to start with my own code, which we now have to upload. Now, regarding what to upload here, this is easy to mess up, so let's do it together. We go into the backend folder, and there we select all files. And that's important. Go into that folder and select the files. Don't select the top level folder. And then simply compress them, so zip them. And you can, of course, do that on both Windows and Mac. This will give you a zip file, and it's this zip file which you now select. Here, you can choose a local file in the backend folder, choose that zip file and click Open, and then click Upload. And this will now upload this zip file to your Elastic Beanstalk project, or to be precise, it will do so once you click Create Environment. First of all, let's configure more options though. Here, make sure that low cost is chosen to use the AWS free tier if you still have that available. Now, you can also check what you'll get or what will be created for you. Now, let's modify the software and let's actually pick the latest Node.js version, which is available here, to ensure that our cutting-edge JavaScript code is working correctly. You can leave all the other default settings, though I want to set these environment properties, which are passed into the application. You remember, I said this would be handled by most hosts, or by pretty much all hosting providers. So here I will use my Mongo Atlas password as a key, and that value here as, well, a value. And here, my JWT key, which is also holding a value. I need to do this because we're now, of course, not using NodeMon. So save this. Now the software is configured. The other settings should be all right. So with that, let's click Create Environment now. We'll still use MongoDB Atlas as a cloud database, by the way. If you were using a local one, you will now need to switch to some cloud solution or deploy your local one, which is a topic for a separate course, because database deployment, that is definitely something more advanced. So now this will take a few minutes, and I will be back once this stack, as it is called, so once this app has been deployed. So the setup finished, but with an error, as you can see. Now, if we have a look, you'll see that it failed to run npm install, and that we should see the snapshot logs for more details. We can find them here under health. There, we can have a detailed output of what went wrong. And it failed to install the bcrypt script here. The reason for that is that the bcrypt package we're using here is actually a package which needs to be compiled in the place where you're using it, and that can fail. Now, a fix is to use a different package instead. You install it in your project folder with npm install --save bcrypt.js. That is a special implementation of that which is pre-compiled. So now if you run that, you see that a new entry was added to your package.json file, bcrypt.js. Also copy that to your package.json file which you want to deploy. You can replace bcrypt with it there. You have to replace it to be precise. And now you just have to adjust your code in the places where you use bcrypt, like in user.js, or not like, but in user.js. There you import bcrypt from bcrypt.js. And that's all. The methods it exposes are the same, so this should be all you need to do. With that set up, now you can redeploy this. So let's make sure to create a new zip file. Let's delete the old one and zip all the backend files one more time. And with that, we can replace our current deployment with that by going back to the dashboard and choosing Upload and Deploy. Give it a new version label like 2, and choose your archive again and hit Deploy. And now this will upload this new package and try to put that into production here on this backend. Again, this will take a couple of minutes, so let's wait for this to finish. Now this looks good, but if you click that link here at the top, you will probably get a bad gateway error, which means it's still not working correctly. Let's go back to our setup there, and the reason is that our app is probably not running correctly. Let's go back to configuration and modify the software. And here you can enter the node command which should be run to start your application. Here it actually tells you what it tries to do to start your app. It looks for app.js if you don't enter anything there and tries to start that file. That's the problem. We don't want to start with app.js, we want to start with server.js. That, however, is only its second option. So what you can do here is you can enter a new command here, node server.js, to tell it that it should run the server.js file. Let's click apply then. And now it will again put that into production and update your environment accordingly. And now, once it is done, click refresh if you are not sure if you're seeing the latest status. If you now click this link, it should take a while and then give you another error. Now, do you have an idea where this error is coming from? Well, our URL, just like that, is simply not correct. We don't support that path, but we do support /API posts. So let's try that. And here it then just loads, and eventually it will time out. Do you know which problem we face here? It can be hard to spot this. It's not actually an error with our code, but on our MongoDB hosting service. So let me quickly log in there. In MongoDB Atlas, here as it is called, we of course have that security tab. And there we define the user, but we also, if you remember, define the IP whitelist. And this is our local IP address. So only our local machine is able to access this database. Now, theoretically, it would be best to create a new cluster for production anyways, so that we don't mess with production data while developing. But since this would cost money, we'll stick to this one project. For a real project, you would create and connect a separate cluster. Here, I will do something which you don't want to do for your real production database. I will add another IP address to the whitelist. And this will be the IP address of my node server. So of that server here. How do we find out which address this has? You can go to your dashboard and click on Show All to get a full log of the events that happened. And there you should somewhere see this created EIP thing. And that should be the IP of your instance. If you copy it and put it into your browser, you should get that same error you got when you clicked on the domain. So that is the IP we want to add here to the whitelist, like this. Confirm this, and now this is pending, and once it is done, we should be able to access this MongoDB from our node server on Elastic Beanstalk 2. So let's wait for this to finish. And now with that added, you need to restart your server actually. So let's go back to our dashboard, go to Actions, and click Restart App Servers. And I want to do this because I have to restart my node.js server, of course, because if we don't do that, it doesn't try to reconnect to our MongoDB. And it needs to try that because now it will be allowed. So now if we go back and reload that API posts route, we should see our posts here. So our RESTful API is up and running. This is looking good. Now let's upload our Angular application and see if everything about this is working. In the last video, we deployed our RESTful API, our backend. Now we want to deploy the Angular application, the front end. And for that, we'll use the CLI to build it. Building it means taking all the TypeScript code and the Angular code and compiling that to a bunch of JavaScript and HTML files, well, one HTML file and a bunch of JavaScript files that make up the application. Because everything about Angular happens in the browser, right? It's a client side, it's a browser framework. It re-renders the page we're seeing in the browser. We can build it with the Angular CLI. In the project folder, simply run ng build and then -- prod to set all the settings to production, which puts the most optimizations into place. So this will now build your project, can take a couple of seconds. And once it is done, it will give you a new folder. Now here we get an error that API URL does not exist. And the reason for this, and that's really important, is that for building for production, it doesn't use your environment file here, where you have that API URL, but it takes the environment prod file, which makes sense because that gives you the advantage of using different settings for production and development. And we actually need these different settings here because our development URL of localhost 3000 certainly is wrong now. So let's add the API URL to the environment.prod file, which is the file getting used when you're building for production. But let's set the URL to the URL we have here on our dashboard. So this URL we're visiting here, you can copy that. This is the URL of our running API. Store it here, and don't forget to add /API after it, just as you did it here for production, for development. With that, let's rerun ng build prod, and now we should be able to build this, and we'll take this new API or this new URL, and it will be included in our code automatically due to our setup we chose in this course. So let's wait for this to finish, and once it is finished, we will have a new folder, the dist folder. And now you need to deploy the content of that dist folder, or to be precise, of the main course folder in that dist folder. So all these files, these are the files you want to deploy to your static frontend host. So let's do that. And AWS also got a service for that. Elastic Beanstalk, which we're using here, is a host for dynamic content. So for PHP or Node.js as we are using it. AWS also has the S3 service, which is their static cloud storage in general, but which can also be used as a static host. You create a new website here by creating a new bucket, and you can choose any name you want, though bucket names are unique globally, so you can't take the name I'm using here. And I will use mean Angular node. You can use any name you want, of course, and simply click create. The default settings should be fine. This should give you the mean Angular node bucket here. Now you can click upload and drag these files, which you have in the dist mean course folder, in here, or manually select them, of course. So you can also click add files, then select that dist folder, and in there, in the mean course folder, all the files in there, open them, click upload, and now this will add them to the bucket. Now the bucket is just a file storage, and by default, it's not accessible by other people. To make it accessible, you need to do two more things. First of all, you need to change the permissions by setting a so-called bucket policy. Here, you can click on documentation to see some examples, because we will need one specific example. You can click on bucket policy examples here. We need the granting read-only permissions to an anonymous user bucket policy, because visitors of our website will be anonymous, and this should give them read access. You can now copy that permission statement here, go back and add this here to this field, and replace example bucket with your bucket name. So in my case, with mean Angular node. And that, of course, are settings which are really only required for AWS S3. Other static hosting providers typically don't have that. S3 has it because it is also a file storage, not just a hosting provider. So with that added, you can click Save. And now we have public access on the bucket, which is correct. And now you can click on Properties and enable static website hosting by clicking on that card. And simply check Use this bucket to host a website. And now important, choose index.html as an index document, and also, and that's really important, as an error document. This second part is required for your Angular routes to work, because if the user enters something like your domain /off/login, that would by default be first parsed by your server. The server doesn't know that route though, and there also is no subfolder named off or login, so it would throw an error. By adding index.html as an error document, it will then forward that error to the index.html file and will execute that file. And since that file contains your Angular app, which knows its routes, the Angular router can then parse the URL, and the Angular router will understand it and render the correct component. So this is absolutely required to ensure that your routes keep on working. So hit save then, and now static website hosting is enabled. Now you can visit your website by going to static website hosting again and clicking that URL. And now this should load your Angular app. And here it is. And what's already good, we're not finding the file, the image, which makes sense because we deleted it. But what's good is that we can see the post except for the image. Now let's try logging in. Let's try selecting the right user here. And that was not the user who created the post, but let's simply create a new post and let's see if that file upload is working. Let's pick an image like spring and click Save Post. And now here we're getting an error, an internal server error. It fails to store that file on our server. And the problem is, we can see it if we inspect the error here in the Network tab and then click on Response, there's no such file or directory backend/images. And that is something we overlooked. We have to adjust our backend code a bit more to make sure that the image is stored correctly, because that backend folder is now incorrect because I moved that server.js file into the backend folder. And we have to see that relative from the server.js file, so this should now just be images here in our Malter middleware. This should just be images because this is where we're storing the images now. This also has an implication for the app.js file. There, we're serving images statically by also looking at backend images. Now this is just images now, just the images folder. So if we save that, we have to redeploy our backend, which is no problem, of course. We can simply delete the old archive, select all backend files and folders again and recompress them, and go back to our Elastic Beanstalk console here. And let's redeploy that version. Click on your app, upload and deploy, choose a new version label, choose that new archive tag where we choose that new archive, that new zip file where we did update the code to not look for the backend subfolder. And let's wait for this to update our environment. And thereafter, let's again try to add a new image or add a new post. So it's done redeploying. Let's reload our mean application. And let's again try to upload a post here. Now this is looking better. There's our image. Now let's also try editing this and let's pick a different image, the spring image, and let's update the title. This also works. That error, that first error, is always coming from that first post, which doesn't have an image because we created that post locally and I cleared all images before deploying. Let's now try deleting that, and this also works. So this all seems to work. Now let's switch the user to the user who hopefully created that other post. And now let's clear that too. And now we got a clear app again and get no errors here. So now this is working, and now we successfully deployed our application to a real server. We deployed it by deploying two different apps, the REST API and the Angular app. In the last lectures, we deployed our app by deploying it as two separated apps, Backend and Angular app. We can also deploy it as one app though. For that, let's first of all make sure that we build our Angular app as a folder into our backend folder, so that we just deploy the entire content of the backend folder as one single app. For that, we can go to the Angular JSON file, which is used by the CLI to configure our project, and there we can change the output path for when we are building our application. We can do that here under output path. Let's change this to backend Angular. You can name this whatever you want. Now with that, if you run ng build -- prod, it should build that Angular app into a subfolder of your backend folder. So into that Angular subfolder that should be created there. Of course, make sure to choose a folder which doesn't exist yet. So using controllers would not be ideal because you would delete your existing code. Now once it's done, you have that new Angular folder here, which contains the compiled application. And now we just need to adjust our code here to serve that application successfully. It would be an idea to serve our Angular app if we're getting a request which is just targeting /nothing. So if we have requests targeting API posts or users, we forward them to these routes. If we have a request targeting anything else actually, then I want to handle that with Angular, let's say. That setting is especially important, by the way, because you want to ensure that the Angular router can take over. And if you only forward requests targeting slash to the Angular app, then you would not be able to handle the cases where the user directly enters /off/login, for example. And you don't want to manually set up all these paths here to map them to an Angular page. Instead, you always want to return that Angular index.html file. So this file, you always want to return that if it is a route you're not recognizing otherwise. So if it's not one of your API routes, basically. That also means that you must not use a path you have defined here in your Angular app with the Angular router, because it will never reach the Angular router because it would be handled by the backend first. That's important to keep in mind. All other requests should be handled though, and therefore we simply don't need a filter here. Instead, whenever we reach this part here, which we don't if we make it into one of these routes, then I want to return the Angular app. So here I define my well-known function with request response next. And here I want to send back a file, the index.html file. So here I can call send file. And here I just want to select that index.html file. And here we have to define an absolute path, which I'll do with the help of the path package here. So I will create a path by using path join here, and I'll join the Angular folder with the index.html file there. This should forward that file for any request not targeting any of our API routes. And we can test this locally by running npm run start server. This will spin up the node server, and we can test it by opening a new tab and visiting localhost 3000, because that is our local testing domain of the Node Express app. And now that we're serving everything from one server, this is the way to test it. And here, it's not working because I forgot something. We need to start with dir name, which is the absolute path to this folder, which is important to have a valid path in the first place. So add this and then let it reload, and now reload that page. And we now got an empty page here. And the reason for that is that we do get back our Angular application. As you can tell, if you reload with the network tab opened, you do get that index.html file with the app root element, but all the scripts are not loaded correctly. Because we need to do one other thing, we need to allow static access to that Angular folder, just as we did it for images earlier in the course. So we can copy that line for accessing images, but here important, we actually want to forward requests going to just /nothing, because we're going to serve Angular for any other route. So we don't want to make any assumptions about the route. It should fake as if it were serving that from the root folder, but then it should be reaching out to the Angular folder. Additionally, we have to join dir name and Angular. We should also do that on images, by the way. Here for Angular, this is absolutely required though, otherwise this request here can't reach, or the requests sent by the index.html file, I should say, can't reach the JavaScript files and so on it needs. So now if you save that with that updated static route here, if you reload the page, now you see the Angular app here too. So now this seems to work. So now this is the solution which we can deploy. Here we can also quickly test if we can log in and so on. Let's test it all locally. Let's create a new post with an image. That is working. And let's delete the post so that we don't have it in the database. Now we can deploy that solution. So let's quit our local testing server. And let's instead, again, package that all up. Now keep in mind, this contains our Angular app, and that's important. You always need to rebuild the app before shipping a new version to the server. And then we can go back to our Elastic Beanstalk application and upload the new version, includes Angular, choose that file from the backend folder, that archive.zip file, and deploy that version, which now does include Angular and these updated settings regarding our routing or how we load Angular. This also means that we will be able to shut down S3 and not use it anymore. So let's wait for this to redeploy. And now that it's done, let's click that link. And here it does load the Angular app as it should. And now let's test it here too. Let's log in. Let's create a new post testing this. Let's pick an image and add some content. And now if I save this, this also works as before. Also, if we edit it without editing it, or edit it with editing it, or if we log out and log in with a different user, then we also still see this, but we can't edit it. But now we can add our new content here, of course, just as we could do it locally, but now again on the server, but now in one combined application. And we can also still delete this, of course. So now everything is working as it was working throughout the course, but now we deployed it. And it's up to you whether you choose that combined solution or the split up one. Now you typically take the one with two apps if you also plan to use your API with other client-side applications, like let's say a mobile application. And you might lean towards the integrated approach with one app only if you have, well, only that one app, if you got no other clients connecting to it, and if you therefore want to have everything run on one server. Keep in mind, you can now also remove these headers here. If I comment them out in the app.js file and I redeploy this, so let's compress that all again, and let's again go back to our console here, to the Elastic Beanstalk console, and let's choose that new archive zip file. If I now deploy this, you will see the Angular app will still continue to work. And this is only the case if you have that integrated approach, because now everything is running on the same server. It would not work if you had different servers. This, of course, also means no one else can access your API. And if that's important for you, and you only got one client app that should connect to it, that would be another argument for using that integrated one app only approach. Both is absolutely fine. You see both in action, and that is why it was important to me to show you both. So let's just wait for this to finish. Let's reload that. And there you can see if I do log in again, this still works as before. We got no course errors. The image was just missing because I redeployed the entire folder, which contains the image folder. And now, again, we got a working application.